The summons arrived in a language that did not technically contain verbs, which Dorian decided was unfair given the urgency implied by the pulsing crimson seal. He stared at it from the safety of his translation desk, surrounded by floating lexicons and a mug of tea that had gone cold sometime during the previous galactic crisis. When he finally opened the message, it unfolded itself into a polite demand that he present himself immediately at the inner spire, level 0, private quarters. Private quarters were where secrets went to suffocate, and translators were rarely invited there unless someone wanted the secret to survive translation. The transport tube carried him upward through the palace like a swallowed thought. Outside the transparent walls, the city of Valector spiraled in impossible geometry, towers bending slightly to compensate for gravity wells installed centuries ago by engineers with more ambition than caution. Dorian practiced calming breaths and failed at all of them. He reminded himself that this was probably about tariffs or border definitions or the perennial misunderstanding between the words for peace and temporary cessation of hostilities. He also reminded himself that he had once fainted during a committee meeting over a seating chart, so expectations should remain modest. The doors to the chamber parted without ceremony. Inside, the light was warm and low, filtered through crystalline panels that hummed faintly, as if remembering older songs. Empress Valen stood near a window that looked out on nothing at all, the stars carefully hidden. She turned as he entered, and for a moment Dorian forgot every language he knew. She looked human enough to unsettle him, same proportions, same expressive face, but the long ears swept back through her silver-dark hair marked her as something older, listening to more than sound. When she smiled, it was precise, almost cautious. "You may sit," she said in flawless standard, then added, "unless standing makes you feel braver. It does that for me, but I'm told it's uncommon." Dorian sat immediately and too fast. The chair adjusted to his shape with a sigh of relief. "Your Radiance," he began, then stopped when she raised a hand. "Valen," she said, "we are not in court. Also, I dislike titles. They itch." She gestured and a service drone drifted forward to pour tea. The aroma was unmistakably cinnamon. Dorian blinked. "That's, earth spice." "I am aware," Valen said. "I had the kitchens attempted 17 times. The first 16 were insults. This one is acceptable." He took a cautious sip. It was perfect. That frightened him more than the summons. "I assume," he said, "this concerns the upcoming negotiations with the outer systems?" Valen studied him, her ears angling slightly forward. "Partially, but mostly, this concerns you." Dorian waited for the universe to clarify the joke. It did not. Valen crossed the room and activated a hollow panel. Data blossomed between them, spirals of genetic code, probability arcs, equations so dense they felt personal. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, explaining an ancient succession protocol, a compatibility scan long treated as symbolic reassurance. Her voice was steady, almost gentle, as she explained how it had not been symbolic this time. "You are," she said, "the only viable match." Dorian laughed, a short, helpless sound. "For what? A committee?" "For me," Valen said. "For an heir. For survival." Silence stretched. Somewhere, a machine adjusted the room's gravity by a fraction, as if embarrassed. Dorian rubbed his face. "I should be clear," he said. "I translate threats for a living. I am very good at making terrible news sound reasonable. This does not sound reasonable." Valen's smile softened, and one ear flicked back. "I was hoping you would say that. It means the universe has not broken you yet." He looked at the stars that weren't there, and wondered when his life had quietly turned into someone else's epic. Dorian discovered that there were two kinds of silence in the palace. The ceremonial kind, which was padded and respectful and usually accompanied by incense, and the private kind, which sat beside you and waited to see what you would do with it. This was the second kind. It had followed him out of Valen's chamber and down the softly lit corridors, clinging to him through the transport tube and into his assigned quarters like an unpaid bill. He spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling as it gently reconfigured itself into a simulated sky. At some point it chose a sunset over an ocean he had never visited, which felt unkind. His personal assistant drone hovered nearby, its optic blinking. Would you like calming frequencies? It asked. No, Dorian muttered. I'd like the universe to admit this is a misunderstanding. The drone paused. I do not have that function. In the morning, the palace behaved as if nothing extraordinary had happened, which Dorian found deeply suspicious. Servants bowed, officials nodded. A junior diplomat tried to corner him about a footnote dispute involving mineral rights and the word for shared. Dorian handled it on reflex, his mind replaying Valen's calm voice and the impossible certainty of the data. You are the only viable match. The phrase had rhythm now, like a song he couldn't turn off. He was summoned again that evening, this time not by a dramatic seal, but by a discreet ping that politely refused to be ignored. Valen's chamber looked the same, though she did not. She wore no regalia now, only a simple garment that shifted color with her movement. Her long ears were unadorned, and she seemed younger for it, or perhaps just less armored. You slept poorly, she said. I didn't sleep at all, Dorian replied, but the ceiling was very supportive. She laughed, brief and genuine, and motioned him closer. Sit. If you faint, it will complicate matters. I faint gracefully, he said, sitting. I've had practice. Valen activated the holopanel again, but this time it showed not equations, but histories. Star systems collapsing into conflict, alliances fracturing, projections of unrest. She spoke of the Empire's slow unraveling, of factions clinging to purity myths, while the universe grew more interconnected and less forgiving. The hybrid heir was not a romantic notion. It was a stabilizing constant, a bridge written into flesh. I did not choose this, she said quietly, but I am choosing you. Dorian swallowed. Your court will never accept me. No, Valen agreed, which is why they will not know. Not yet. They discussed logistics with the surreal calm of people planning a picnic rather than a secret imperial marriage. There were eclipses to consider, ancient observatories still shielded from surveillance, and artificial intelligence bound by archaic neutrality protocols that could serve as witness. Dorian found himself laughing at the absurdity of it, which seemed to please her. You joke when afraid, she observed. I joke when breathing, he said. Fear just improves the timing. Days passed in a strange double life. By day, Dorian translated treaties and smoothed tensions, his words carrying more weight now that he knew what failure meant. By night, he learned Valen, not the Empress, but the woman who complained about palace acoustics and admitted she snored during stress dreams. Her ears betrayed her moods, angling and twitching despite her efforts to control them. He teased her gently about it, and she retaliated by correcting his posture during meditation sessions he had not agreed to attend. The danger crept closer. A court inquisitor began asking questions that lingered too long. A noble proposed a public union with Valen, couched in rhetoric so polished it squeaked. Dorian felt the pressure settle into his bones. One evening, overwhelmed, he blurted, If this goes wrong, my mother will say she always knew I should have stayed in linguistics. Valen smiled, tired but steady. If this goes wrong, history will say I hesitated. I prefer your mother's judgment. They stood together by the hidden stars, the universe vast and indifferent beyond the walls. Dorian realized that somewhere between panic and laughter, he had crossed a line he could not see, and perhaps did not want to. The palace began to feel smaller, which Dorian knew was an illusion, because it was technically larger than several cities he had lived in, but illusions were persuasive things when fed regularly. Corridors seemed to curve back on themselves, and doors took a fraction longer to open, as if weighing his importance against their own schedules. He had started greeting walls out of habit, just in case they were listening, which in this building was not paranoia so much as politeness. Valen noticed first. She always did. You are walking like someone who expects the floor to betray him, she said one evening as they met in a transit alcove disguised as a maintenance junction. Her long ears were angled back, not in alarm but in calculation. She wore the faintest smile, the kind that suggested she had already solved a problem he had not yet admitted existed. I tripped over nothing twice today, Dorian said. Either the gravity fluctuated or the palace is developing opinions about me. The palace has always had opinions, Valen replied. It simply rarely shares them. They moved through a sequence of corridors that rearranged themselves in response to Valen's presence, ancient systems recognizing authority older than their own code. Dorian tried not to stare when walls shimmered and dissolved into new paths. He failed, but quietly. His job had always been to translate meaning, not architecture. In the observatory annex, they found temporary refuge. The ceiling displayed a slow drift of stars, each labeled in a language Dorian could not read but somehow understood emotionally, which he decided was unfair. Valen sat on the edge of the central platform and gestured for him to join her. "The Inquisitor is accelerating," she said without preamble. "He believes secrecy is a confession waiting to happen." Dorian sighed. "On Earth, we say curiosity killed the cat. Here, I assume the cat becomes a senator." Valen laughed, her ears flicking forward. "Here, the cat writes a report." She explained the political currents with careful precision. The court was restless, fearful of change masked as reverence for tradition. The proposed public union loomed like a ceremonial blade, gleaming and useless. Every choice narrowed, every delay sharpened suspicion. "I can withdraw," Dorian said quietly. "You could say the scan was flawed. Statistical noise. I could go back to translating arguments about asteroid zoning." Valen turned to him then, fully, her expression serious in a way that made his chest tighten. "Do not offer yourself as an escape route," she said. "I will not use you that way." Silence settled, gentler this time. Dorian found himself smiling despite it. "I'm not heroic," he said. "I once apologized to a vending machine." "That may be your greatest qualification," Valen replied. "This empire is full of people who never apologize." They trained him in secrecy as one might train an animal not to trigger alarms. There were codes woven into gestures, pauses timed to surveillance sweeps, humor used as misdirection. Dorian discovered that jokes disarm suspicion more effectively than silence. When a minor official commented on his increased palace access, he replied that translators were being tested for durability. The official laughed and forgot to ask why. At night, Valen allowed herself moments of candor. She spoke of childhood beneath vaulted ceilings, of lessons that emphasized duty over desire, of ears tugged by tutors to correct posture and attention. Dorian listened, translating nothing, simply being present. He realized how rarely anyone did that for her. One evening, an automated system misfired and sealed them briefly in a transit pod. The lights dimmed and the pod hummed nervously. "This is not how I intended to be trapped with you," Valen said. Dorian glanced around. "I've had worse dates." She stared at him, then laughed so hard she had to brace herself, her ears twitching uncontrollably. The pod released them moments later, but something lingered, lighter than fear and heavier than relief. As the secret pressed closer to exposure, Dorian felt himself changing. Not braver, exactly, but steadier. He learned when to speak and when to let silence do the work. He learned that humor could be a bridge rather than a shield. And he learned that standing beside Valen, listening to a future only they could hear, felt less like a mistake and more like a translation finally done right. By the time the palace kitchens learned to anticipate Dorian's footsteps, he knew the situation had entered a dangerous phase. Familiarity was a kind of visibility, and visibility was the enemy. The head chef greeted him by name one morning and offered a pastry for courage, which Dorian accepted on the grounds that courage was clearly carbohydrate-based. He ate it while reading a briefing that politely suggested several noble houses were requesting increased access to the Empress for reassurance. Reassurance, he had learned, was court dialect for inspection. Valen summoned him not to her chambers this time, but to a sub-level archive that smelled faintly of ozone and dust that had never been organic. The doors sealed behind them with a sound that suggested finality and excellent engineering. Rows of crystalline memory stacks glowed softly, each holding fragments of imperial history. Valen stood among them, hands clasped behind her back, ears angled outward in a posture Dorian recognized as irritation, carefully disguised as patience. "They are closing rank," she said. "Tradition always does when it senses irrelevance." Dorian leaned against a console that immediately adjusted its temperature to accommodate him, which felt oddly intimate. "On my world," he said, "tradition mostly closes ranks around holidays and refuses to move." Valen smiled thinly. "Here, it sharpens." She explained that the Inquisitor had gained allies, that whispers were becoming questions, and questions were acquiring dates. The rival noble's proposal was imminent, wrapped in ceremony so elaborate it would make refusal look like sacrilege. Dorian listened, nodding, his translator's instincts cataloging tone and subtext, even when none were meant for him. "So," he said finally, "we're running out of quiet." "Yes," Valen replied, "which leaves us with only loud options and one very old one." She led him deeper into the archive to a chamber where an ancient interface pulsed slowly, like a heart remembering how. This was the witness, an artificial intelligence bound by protocols written before the Empire had decided what it wanted to be. It could officiate rites no one else remembered and record them in a way that made denial complicated. The witness activated as they approached, its voice layered with centuries. "State intent," it intoned. Dorian cleared his throat. "We're just looking," he said. "No pressure." Valen shot him a look that suggested pressure was the point. "We intend," she said calmly, "to prepare." The witness hummed. "Preparation acknowledged. Emotional variance detected." "That's just him," Valen said. They rehearsed the ceremony in fragments, careful not to complete any sequence. The language was old, dense with metaphors that felt uncomfortably literal. Dorian stumbled over pronunciations that implied shared futures and mutual risk. Valen corrected him gently, occasionally teasing him when his accent turned a vow into a culinary term. "I am not promising to sauté you," he protested. "Pity," she said. It sounded binding. Between rehearsals, the pressure mounted. Surveillance tightened. Dorian noticed new eyes in corridors, new pauses in conversation when he entered a room. He countered with charm and self-deprecation, joking about translators being harmless by definition. It worked until it didn't. The Inquisitor confronted him in a gallery of ancestral holograms, their silent gazes heavy with judgment. He asked questions that were not questions, smiled without warmth, and suggested that loyalty was best proven in daylight. Dorian replied with careful honesty and a joke about his allergy to sunlight. The Inquisitor did not laugh. That night, Valen found Dorian in the observatory, staring at a star map that updated itself in real time. His reflection looked older somehow. "I can end this," she said softly. "I can choose the public path and bear the consequences." Dorian turned to her. "And condemn your people to slow collapse?" Her ears angled back. "I would survive it." "I know," he said. "That's the problem. You'd survive alone." Silence, then a small, surprised laugh from Valen. "You are terrible at retreat," she said. "I specialize in stubborn misunderstanding," he replied. "This seems like one." They decided. The ceremony would happen at the next eclipse, in the forgotten observatory beyond the city's reach. Risk accepted, secrecy stretched thin. As they parted, Valen touched his arm briefly, a grounding gesture that sent an unreasonable amount of reassurance through him. As Dorian returned to his quarters, the palace lights dimmed in a pattern he didn't recognize. Somewhere, alarms were being tested, or perhaps fate was clearing its throat. He lay awake that night, listening to the building breathe, and realized that fear had given way to something steadier. Not certainty, not courage, but commitment. The quiet decision to translate himself into a future that had never planned for him and might, just might, be better for it. The eclipse arrived disguised as maintenance. That was the first thing Dorian noticed as the palace systems shifted into their lowest alert state, lights dimming to a practical glow, while automated notices politely informed everyone that orbital recalibration would briefly interrupt non-essential observation decks. Non-essential, it turned out, included most of the places people liked to look when secrets were being kept. The palace exhaled, settling into a rhythm designed centuries ago for moments when rulers needed the universe to look the other way. Dorian moved through the service corridors wearing a technician's cloak that was 2 sizes too confident. It adjusted its color to match the walls, which would have been reassuring if it hadn't also adjusted its posture, straightening his shoulders without asking. He felt vaguely betrayed by his own clothing. "Stop trying to make me look competent," he muttered. The cloak ignored him, which felt personal. At the final junction, Valen was already waiting. She wore no insignia, no symbols of office, only a dark, adaptive fabric that responded subtly to her pulse. Her long ears were uncovered, swept back not in fear but focus. the way they did when she was listening to things that had not yet happened. When she saw him, her expression softened into something that belonged to neither empress nor strategist. "You made it," she said. "So far," Dorian replied. "I have not been arrested, vaporized, or congratulated. All good signs." They shared a brief smile and stepped into the transit pod together. The pod detached silently and slid into the hidden track that ran beyond the palace shell, out toward the abandoned observatory that predated most of the city. As they traveled, the eclipse began, a slow, deliberate dimming as the artificial moon aligned perfectly with the system's star. Gravity shifted by a fraction, enough to make Dorian's stomach notice and complain. "If I float," he said, "this will lose all dignity." Valen considered. "The witness does not require dignity, only sincerity." "That's worse," he said. The observatory emerged from shadow like a memory refusing to stay buried. Its structure was ancient, grown rather than built, lattices of dark crystal curving inward toward a central chamber open to the sky. The stars above were muted now, the eclipse rendering them pale and distant, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. Inside, the witness waited. Its presence filled the chamber without occupying it, a low harmonic vibration that settled into Dorian's bones. Light gathered, forming a shape that was not quite a face but felt like attention, given form. "Parties identified," the witness intoned. "Temporal window acceptable. Risk parameters elevated. Emotional variance significant." Valen stepped forward, steady. "Proceed." Dorian followed, acutely aware that every step was irreversible in the way jokes never were. The language of the ceremony unfolded around them, spoken partly aloud, partly through resonance that bypassed sound entirely. The words were old, layered with meaning that pressed gently but firmly, like hands guiding rather than pushing. When it came time for Dorian to speak, his throat tightened. "I am not," he began, then stopped. He laughed quietly, the sound echoing inappropriately. "I'm sorry, I just realized no one ever trained me for this." Valen's eyes warmed. "Speak as you are," she said. "The protocol allows improvisation. It learned that from us?" Dorian took a breath. "I do not promise certainty," he said carefully. "I promise attention. I promise to listen when things change, because they will. I promise to be confused honestly and brave accidentally." The witness paused. "Statement accepted. Parameters unconventional. Compatibility unchanged." Valen spoke next, her voice clear, unadorned. She promised protection not as a shield, but as a partnership. Leadership that bent rather than broke. Risk shared rather than delegated. As she spoke, her ears angled forward, open and unguarded. The chamber pulsed once, twice, and then settled. A soft tone sounded, not celebratory, not solemn, but complete. "Union recorded," the witness declared. "Secrecy maintained. Consequences pending." "Always nice to hear," Dorian said faintly. They did not have time to linger. Even ancient protocols could only stretch reality so far. As they prepared to leave, a tremor ran through the observatory, not structural, but informational. Alerts flickered at the edge of Dorian's awareness, palace systems waking abruptly. "They know something," he said. Valen nodded. "Not everything, but enough." They returned faster than they came, slipping back into the palace as alarms bloomed like controlled panic. Dorian was pulled into motion, into role, into instinct. When Valen took her place before the court to address the sudden unrest, he stood beside her, not named, not explained, but visible. She spoke of threats, external and internal, of unity required not by tradition, but by survival. Dorian translated her words across channels, shaping them for 100 cultures at once. When a senator demanded clarity, he added gently, "History rarely offers it up front." A ripple of laughter spread, easing tension just enough. The inquisitor watched from the shadows, calculating. The rival noble hesitated. The people listened. Later, in the quiet that followed, Valen found Dorian in a side chamber, leaning against a wall that pretended not to care. "You changed the tone," she said. "They followed you." "I just translated what you meant," he replied, with fewer sharp edges. She studied him, then smiled, tired and luminous. Then we may survive this. Dorian smiled back, feeling the weight of the universe settle differently now. Not lighter, exactly, but shared. Morning in the palace arrived with the delicate enthusiasm of someone pretending nothing unusual had happened. Light filtered through the upper crystal arrays at precisely the approved angle. Birds that were technically drones resumed their decorative flight patterns, and the court schedule updated itself with calm confidence. Dorian watched all of this from a balcony that overlooked 3 converging gravity gardens and felt the oddest thing, relief edged with disbelief, like waking after a dream that had not entirely released him. Valen joined him without announcement. She had a talent for that now, appearing beside him as if proximity were simply the natural state of things. Her posture was composed, imperial even, but there was a looseness to it that had not been there before. Her long ears were relaxed, angled slightly outward, listening but no longer braced. "You are awake early," she said. "I didn't sleep," Dorian replied, but this time it was excitement, not existential dread. "Progress." She allowed herself a small smile. "The court believes yesterday was an unfortunate convergence of data errors and external pressure. They will spend weeks arguing about which committee is responsible." "On Earth," Dorian said, "that's considered a happy ending." They walked together through the corridors, no longer avoiding the main routes, but not advertising anything either. The secret of the union hung between them, present but oddly light, like a shared joke the room didn't yet understand. Officials bowed to Valen, nodded to Dorian with increasing frequency, their expressions thoughtful rather than suspicious. Visibility had shifted. It was no longer dangerous by default. That unsettled him more than scrutiny ever had. The Inquisitor requested an audience. The message was impeccably polite, which meant it was anything but harmless. Valen read it once, then handed it to Dorian. "He wishes clarification," she said. "Of course he does," Dorian replied. "Clarification is curiosity wearing armor." They met the Inquisitor in a chamber designed to intimidate through scale. The ceiling arced high enough to make voices feel temporary, and holographic records of past judgments hovered like patient ghosts. The Inquisitor himself stood very still, hands folded, eyes sharp. "You have been present," he said to Dorian. "More than your role requires." Dorian nodded thoughtfully. Translation often expands. Words lead to context. Context leads to meetings. Meetings lead to regret. Valen hid her smile badly. The Inquisitor turned to her. "The Empire requires transparency." "It requires survival," Valen replied evenly. "Transparency is a tool, not a virtue." They spoke for a long time, circling truths without naming them. Dorian found himself doing what he did best, reframing, softening, offering humor where rigidity threatened to crack the floor beneath them. When the Inquisitor pressed too hard, Dorian observed lightly that secrecy had preserved empires longer than honesty ever had. The Inquisitor did not laugh, but he listened. In the end, he withdrew, not convinced but contained. As he left, his gaze lingered on Dorian with something like recalculation. "That," Dorian said once they were alone, "went better than expected." "Yes," Valen agreed, "which worries me." The days that followed were a careful dance. Valen addressed the court more frequently, speaking of adaptation, of alliances that crossed old boundaries. Dorian stood near her often now, introduced as an advisor on intercultural coherence, which sounded important enough to discourage questions. He translated speeches across the empire, his voice becoming familiar, trusted. Jokes slipped in where they could, easing fear with laughter, reminding people that change did not always arrive screaming. At night, in the quiet spaces the palace still offered, Valen allowed herself moments of exhaustion. She admitted fears she had never voiced, of being remembered as the ruler who bent too far, of risking everything on a variable the universe had thrown at her with cruel precision. Dorian listened, occasionally offering reassurance, occasionally offering nothing but presence. "I never wanted to be essential," he said once. "I liked being useful." Valen regarded him with gentle intensity. "You are both," she said, "and neither defines you." They reviewed projections together, watching probability curves shift subtly in their favor. The hybrid heir remained an abstract concept for now, a future humming softly at the edge of planning. Dorian joked about baby-proofing a palace designed to withstand sieges. Valen countered that children were far more destructive than armies. As the empire stabilized, tensions easing not through force but through redefinition, Dorian felt the change settle into him. He was no longer reacting. He was participating, translating not just language but intention, fear, hope. The universe had not simplified, but it had become legible in a way it never had before. One evening, standing beneath a sky finally allowed to show its stars, Valen took his hand openly. No announcement followed. No gasp rippled through the court. It simply happened, and the world adjusted, as worlds sometimes do. Dorian squeezed her hand and smiled. "We're still a terrible idea," he said. "Yes," Valen replied, "but a remarkably effective one." Above them, the stars continued their patient drift, indifferent yet accommodating, as if the universe, having objected loudly enough, had decided to watch with interest instead. The first sign that the universe had accepted their decision was not a proclamation or a treaty, but a scheduling error. Dorian noticed it while reviewing the morning briefings, sipping tea that had finally learned how to stay warm in the palace's shifting gravity. 3 councils, 2 trade delegations, and 1 ceremonial observance had all been booked into the same chamber at the same hour. The palace systems flagged it as statistically impossible. "That's new," Dorian murmured. Valen glanced over his shoulder, her long ears angling forward with interest. "The palace has not made a mistake like that in 4 centuries. "Then it's either a bug," Dorian said, "or a sign." They arrived together and found the chamber already full. Instead of chaos, there was laughter. Representatives from rival factions were arguing amiably about who would arrive first, trading jokes about ancient grudges that had outlived their usefulness. Someone had produced food. Someone else had admitted publicly that the old way was exhausting. Valen watched, silent, her expression unreadable, until Dorian felt her fingers brush his hand. Just once. Enough. The Inquisitor entered last. He paused at the threshold, taking in the scene, the mingling, the ease, the absence of fear. When he met Dorian's eyes, there was no suspicion there now, only calculation reshaped by reality. He inclined his head, a gesture so small it might have been missed by anyone not trained to read meaning into silence. Later, in a formal session broadcast across the empire, Valen addressed her people. She spoke of continuity, not rupture, of survival through change rather than resistance to it. She did not announce a marriage. She did not need to. The empire had already begun telling itself a different story, one where borders softened and futures widened. Dorian stood beside her, openly now. No one asked why. Afterward, the rival noble requested a private conversation. He arrived stiffly and left thoughtful, having been offered a new role that preserved his pride without sacrificing progress. The Inquisitor submitted a report recommending the retirement of several obsolete doctrines due to inefficiency. The witness sent a single message to Valen and Dorian both. Consequences stabilizing. Interest continues. "That thing is enjoying this," Dorian said. Valen smiled. "It has been bored for centuries." Time, which had once felt compressed and sharp, began to stretch again. Not empty, but livable. Dorian resumed translating, though his work had changed. He was asked now to shape conversations before they hardened into conflict, to name misunderstandings before they became weapons. He found that he was good at it in a way he hadn't been before. Not because he had learned new languages, but because he had learned what it cost to bridge them. One evening, standing in the old observatory beneath a sky no longer hidden, Dorian realized he was not afraid. The thought startled him. Fear had been his companion for so long he had mistaken it for vigilance. Now there was only awareness, steady and calm. "I used to think survival meant avoiding mistakes," he said aloud. Valen turned to him, her ears catching the softness in his voice. "And now?" "And now I think it means choosing which mistakes are worth making." She regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. "You have changed." "So have you," he said. "You laugh more." "Only at appropriate moments," she replied. "And at you." The future did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived quietly in reports that trended upward, in alliances that held, in children playing in palace corridors, that had once echoed only with formality. The idea of an heir shifted from desperation to possibility, from secret to hope. When Dorian looked back at the man who had first entered the inner spire, he barely recognized him. That man had believed his role was to soften other people's truths. This one understood that sometimes the bravest translation was of oneself. Fear into commitment, chance into choice. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, yet somehow accommodating. The empire endured, the future unfolded, and Dorian, translator of impossible things, stood exactly where he was meant to be, listening.